Thank you very much. So that's, as you can see on the slide, the title of my paper, a paper that brings together three case studies that, as Ron has anticipated, raise a shared set of questions about Scottish writing, Scottish migration, and also the empire in the early 19th century. And as you can see, and as Ron said, these three case studies are John Leyden in India, then Lady Anne Barnard, and Thomas Pringle in South Africa. Each of them is a Scottish migrant writing from within an imperial setting, but from strikingly different vantage points. Leyden as a scholar and the East India Company administrator, Barnard as a colonial wife, correspondent and observer, and Thomas Pringle as a settler poet and later a reformer. Now, what connects them is not a common or a single political stance, but a shared historical condition. Scotland's ambiguous position in the British imperial project after the Union of 1707. Because the writings help us see how Scottishness becomes entangled with empire in ways that are intellectually curious, but also morally uneasy, and often also, I would say, conflicted. So these, sorry, I forgot, of course, showing the second slide. So these are the three case studies. They're pictures, and yes, what basically I'm going to focus on. Now, so I was mentioning this, Scotland's complex imperial position. Since the 1990s, a substantial body of historical and critical work has confronted Scotland's entanglement with empire, often stressing the scale of Scottish participation in Britain's global expansion. For instance, historians such as Tom Devine and John M. Mackenzie have shown that Scotland's contribution to colonialism was both extensive and deeply ambivalent. And it was ambivalent because it is shaped by the loss of sovereignty after the Union, after 1707, and also a disproportionate, though, presence in colonial administration. At the same time, scholars have stressed the reach of Scottish Enlightenment ideas within imperial administration. For example, the concepts of social development, historical change, and improvement. These frameworks traveled with the Scottish migrants into the colonies. They definitely traveled with the writers I am dealing with today. And yet, migration also generates friction, because encounters with colonial others, both human and non-human others, can unsettle the binaries that are at the core of imperial discourse. So the binaries of colonizer versus colonized, center versus periphery, domestic versus exotic. So reading Leyden, Barnard, and Pringle together, I think lets us see Scottish migration writing as a particularly charged space where transcultural tensions are negotiated across various kinds of writings. So poetry, travel writing, journals, letters. Their work expresses curiosity and sympathy, but also moments of unease, moral unease, and hesitation. So we see reading them a spectrum of responses that are shaped by position, by genre, by gender as well, and as well as varying degrees of implication in colonial power by them. Okay, I would like to begin with John Leyden. His experience in India shows how Scottish Enlightenment habits of thought, Orientalist scholarship, and literary production intersect with the machinery, let's say, of colonial government. Leyden's biography is important, here is relevant. He was the son of a shepherd from the Scottish borders, but he went to the University of Edinburgh, better Edinburgh University, where he studied moral philosophy, political economy, and then medicine. And he traveled to India in 1803 as assistant surgeon for the East India Company. But he was very ambitious, so his ambitions went far beyond this and beyond, this role as assistant surgeon. In fact, even before leaving Britain, he showed an extraordinary confidence in his command of languages, and apparently he could master an impressive repertoire of Oriental languages, which included Sanskrit, Persian, Burmese, Hindustani. And he was aware that language mastery could open doors to both intellectual prestige and also administrative authority. And indeed, in India, this expertise in languages became almost, I would say, institutional power for him. Thanks to patronage networks, which included Walter Scott and colonial governors such as Lord Dundas and Lord Minto, Leyden moved through several influential company roles. In 1807, he was appointed professor of Hindustani at the College of Fort William, and then also secretary of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. And it's interesting that he was aware that he was part in India of a kind of community, even more than that. He defines it as a colony. This is what we can read in a letter he wrote from Calcutta in 1805, where he says, "I have met with the utmost attention from Mr. Dundas and all of them who form a little Scottish," he says, "colony here." The phrase "little Scottish colony" is interesting because it places Leyden inside a recognizable expatriate network of Scots, who, in fact, we know exerted influence on imperial governance and also on knowledge production there. So they were rather influential. Critics generally, I would say, consider Leyden as a local Scottish poet. But I think his work on Indian subjects in particular shows how migration could generate feelings of displacement, also individual refashioning and contradiction. So his works written during his experience, his years in India, are extremely interesting, and they are still, I think, overlooked. One striking pattern in his Indian writing is how frequently Indian environments are filtered through Scottish memory. So this interesting juxtaposition between Indian sceneries, landscapes, and his Scotland, the Scotland he left behind. And here you've got an example. I'm not going to read the whole poem for questions of time, of course, time restrictions. But of course, I can, leave the slides, to whoever is interested in having them, and you can read it afterwards. In this poem entitled Ode on Leaving Vellore, an Indian mountain landscape recalls Teviotdale. Leyden here speaks of fancy that conjures the native land. It's not just an expression of homesickness. Here we find a mechanism of perception. The exotic scene becomes overlaid with the domestic, and the sublime textures of India are refracted through a picturesque Scottish lens, I would say. I agree very much with the critic Nigel List when he describes Indian landscapes in Leyden as, I quote, palimpsests for his native hills. And in fact, here we can see that behind the Indian other, that is the Scottish self, is the Scottishness that appears. Comparison and affinity. Comparison and affinity for Leyden become key tools. For instance, here too, Leaving Vellore is compared, in terms of, of emotional experience to when he left Scotland. So we have a comparative impulse at the core of this poem, but not only this poem. And this comparative impulse is not just aesthetic. It is a reflection of the Enlightenment theories of language, culture, and social development that Leyden absorbed while in Edinburgh. And in fact, in Edinburgh, we know that Leyden really, was influenced by Douglas Stewart's as well as Adam Smith's arguments about the links between linguistic and social development. He also drew on so-called stadial models of progress, which ranked society by stages of development, from hunting through pastoral and then agriculture and commercial. And these theories, of course, proved highly adaptable to colonial contexts. We know that Leyden's view of India was influenced by, this text by William Robertson, Historical Disquisition Concerning the Knowledge which the Ancients Had of India. And here, the East, William Robertson writes that the East could certainly progress, he says, on its own terms, although he also adds that Britain might foster, the development, might assist that development, especially during times of stagnation. So this formulation is ambivalent because it may sound respectful of local traditions, but at the same time, it leaves imperial economic and administrative interests firmly there, intact. Leyden's writing embodies this tension, Enlightenment universalism that coexists with imperial hierarchy. But then we also have some of his works, especially later writings, that revise the earlier stereotypes. At times in his writings, we can see how he reproduces some cliches associated with India or the Orient, but there are other times in which he rejects fantasies of Oriental splendor, for example, or sentimental primitivism. So certainly, he never becomes anti-imperial, but his works reveal a restless oscillation, and this is what is interesting, intriguing when I read Leyden. So an oscillation between fascination, irritation towards the other, admiration, and of course also administrative pragmatism. So a fine, I think, crystallization example in his poetry of these tensions appears in the poem entitled Ode on an Indian Gold Coin. The coin here becomes a witness to conquest, exchange, vanity, and displacement. It symbolizes transcultural circulation, but also forces us to think about the unequal conditions that make such a circulation possible. The poem certainly is about India's long cultural history, but then situates that history within a global economy shaped by colonial extraction. Okay, again, ambivalences. Unlike the Ode on Leaving Vellore we've seen before, here the Orient is not folded into Scottish memory. It is rather a disorienting space. Leyden never questions the legitimacy of British rule in India. His admiration for Indian culture usually coexists with participation in colonial administration, we said. So the ambivalence remains there because he is, as I said, an Enlightenment educated Scot, fascinated by cultural difference, cultural and linguistic differences, but also fully enmeshed in imperial power, although he doesn't always feel at ease there. Okay, so but the tensions, the ambiguities remain. He died rather early in 1811 during an expedition to Java. And so all the contradictions, all the tensions, they died with him, remaining unresolved. Now, if Leyden's writings exemplify a mode of scholarly and poetic engagement with colonial otherness that is grounded in Enlightenment theories of knowledge and progress, Lady Anne Barnard's Cape texts she wrote while living at Cape, invite us to consider a different mode of colonial engagement. The engagement of a very perceptive woman close to colonial power, who navigated the political and racial complexities of the Cape through very interesting gendered rhetorical strategies, which in her writings include irony, apology, sometimes self-effacement, reticence. So I have actually studied rather closely, all these strategies that he makes use of in order to convey certain messages, talk about, particularly complex issues in the colonial context, but in a kind of slanted way, we could say, usually. My aim in, doing research and revisiting Barnard is to reassess, the Cape writings, that I mentioned in this slide. A very rich, extensive quantity of journals, letters, diaries that she produced between 1797 and 1802. And these writings, interestingly, they predate Pringle's writing, but they continue to be overlooked, even though they are a very important contribution to Romantic period discourses of race, colonialism, and also Scotland's, of course, imperial role. She was born at Balgaris House in Fife in 1750, and then she moved she moved when she was still young within elite political circles, both in Edinburgh and London. Through her friendship with Henry Dundas, the Secretary of State for War in William Pitt's first administration, her husband was appointed colonial secretary at the Cape. That was during the first British occupation of the Cape. After the cession of the Cape to the Dutch in 1802, the Barnards left. Then, when the British resumed control in 1806, her husband returned to South Africa, but without her, alone, and he died the following year. Barnard spent her final years in London, constantly revising and reworking all her materials, everything that she wrote, in South Africa until she died in 1825. So the question is, asked myself is why would, has she been so overlooked, neglected by critics, despite, this great amount of materials, interesting, really inspiring materials. Well, I think in part it's because of canon formation. We have to consider that most of the works remained unpublished until very recently, and a lot of them still remain unpublished. Even if, as you can see, her archive is huge, as I said. There's so many materials, letters, as I said, diaries, also watercolors and paintings and drawings. You can see here some samples of her pictorial and figurative art. She was also an artist. And they are scattered, in various archives in Scotland, also in South Africa. But, as I said, a lot of these materials are still unedited. The second reason is possibly because she actually became famous mainly as the author of a ballad, Old Robert Gray, that was circulated then posthumously after a death through Walter Scott's publishing networks. And this fame, the popularity of the ballad, I think overshadowed the political richness and the importance of her South African materials. Like Leyden, Barnard wrote from what we may call a colonial contact zone, where colonials, indigenous communities and settlers met under unequal conditions. In her writings, she records frontier conflict, slave trading, the natural environment, but always as a woman that has to negotiate the gender codes of the time. There's a very interesting, there are various interesting passages from this book by Sarah Mills, Discourses of Differences, which I think put, rather well what I'm also trying to say and about Barnard. Here, for example, she shows how women are not simply victims or passive symbols of imperialism. They can participate actively, but they must, she says, always find, ways of using the discourses that were available to them. She proves, Mills, that women's writing can reinforce colonial ideology even, while simultaneously undermine it. And I think Barnard's writing does both. She is aware, very much so, of the boundaries she's not supposed to cross, but then she crosses them, in fact. But at the same time, she disclaims that she's doing so. She's very clever, when she does so. It's a sort of mechanics, we can call it, of reticence. So she speaks through apology, but she does speak. She does say things that may appear, not appropriate for women at the time. In September, these mechanics of reticence, let's see a couple of examples. In September 1799, writing to Lord Dundas, she, for example, frames political opinion as improper. But then says that affection for him allows her to continue. I love you too well to be cautious. And so she goes on. So modesty is turned into a rhetorical license. And then her diaries, we have got her diaries. Her diaries were freer at the time from public scrutiny, intimate, private writings. The diaries intensify, the dynamic, this also mechanics of reticence in a sense. This is an entry from September, same year, September, same year, same month, 1799. She calls it a liberty to speak in a womanish way about those sacred matters called politics, but insists that she must write what she thinks and feels. Again and again in her writings, she performs a sort of assumed, we can say, ignorance, okay, to then, say what she thinks and what she feels. And again, this is another example. She claims here to leave wise matters to men and keep the gossiping department for herself. But it is in the gossip, in fact, that she smuggles the real political insights. For example, she speaks about corruption, power struggles, administrative failures. These aspects emerge, crop up in her writing. So a lot of what she says is politically relevant, but she delivers it in a gender acceptable register. Her tone shifts often across genres and also according to audience expectations. When we compare letters addressed to eminent politicians with the private unabridged diary entries, we can see how chameleon-like, how changeful her writerly self is. And these shifts become most telling when she handles slavery. Which, her handling of slavery oscillates between alignment with colonial society and flashes of moral disturbance. The Cape Journals record, for example, her first confrontation with slavery as a spectacle that challenges her self-image as free-born. We can read here sympathy. Sympathy is present. But it is also, sympathy is somehow, I do think, accompanied by a sense of inadequacy. Inadequacy of feeling that sympathy from someone who lives in a slave-holding household. So it's complicated. There is also a diary entry from March, next slide, from March 1799, in which this tension sharpens. Here she describes, as a specific episode, an illegal cargo of enslaved people arriving from Mozambique as part of a bribe that was accepted by the governor. She wants to attend the auction, but her husband refuses. And then she says she wishes she could be invisible to witness the scene without impropriety and gather testimony for the abolitionist, Mr. Wilberforce. So in one sentence here, she captures the ethical desire to see, but also the constraints of her gender, and a connection also to abolitionist politics beyond the colony, outside the colony. So, of course, these are just, a couple of examples from her writings. There's much, much more there that would deserve attention and analysis. And then there is her visual work that, in a sense, even intensifies the ambivalence or ambiguities that are there at the core of her writings. And I only have the time to show you one example. This is one of her drawings, Sleeping Madonna with a child. It's the image of an enslaved wet nurse breastfeeding a Boer child. Now, this could be might be read as an image of an attempt, in a sense, and this can be disturbing, to aestheticize coercion, to turn coercion and obligation, a form of slavery itself, into an aesthetic picture. But I think it may also convey, on the other hand, an idea of shared motherhood and affect across races. But, you know, the ambiguity remains, and so it's always very complex, you know, to figure out where exactly Barnard stands in relation to slavery issues. Anyway, Barnard's life complicates any easy judgment about sentimentality in this picture, because we know that late in her life, Barnard adopted the daughter of that her husband fathered with an enslaved woman in South Africa. She brought her to London, she gave her an education, and this woman, Christina, as she was called, became a amanuensis late in her life, and she stayed actually with her until Christina got married. So without romanticizing Barnard, I think this history suggests that her humanitarian imagery may be more than an aesthetic gesture. There might be more there. It can be maybe read as a form of, you know, a way of representing, as I said before, cross-racial intimacy, and aspects that colonial ideology officially disavowed. So I think there's more there. So to conclude about Barnard, she was close to power, sometimes aligned with it. Obviously, her family's financial dependence on patronage and appointment was part of the picture. But at the same time, her works probe and unsettle and quietly, secretly, with reticence, resist some colonial norms, especially as regards colonial politics and slavery. And now let's move to my third case study. So from Barnard's gendered and indirect witnessing, yes, we can turn to Thomas Pringle. Maybe is the is possibly the figure among the three that you might know best, because his works have been published, and they are also available in modern editions. A settler poet, a reformer, who also anyway struggled between moral protest and the material facts of colonial settlement. The critic Angus Calder calls him a humanitarian Christian imperialist. That's, of course, in itself an interesting oxymoronic expression, humanitarian Christian imperialist, a writer whose commitments to liberty never fully escaped the structures of empire. And again, Pringle's life is interesting here, because this life was, I would say, dramatically framed by ideas of freedom and also abolition. He was born in Kelso, Leyden in the Scottish border, in 1789, and he died in 1834, a few months after signing a key document connected with abolition. And by 1827, he became secretary of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. His whole career can be thought of in three different phases. The first in Scotland up to 1820, the second at the Cape Colony, 1820-26, and then back in Britain. And across all these three phases, I would say that freedom is a guiding thread. Freedom of speech, freedom from oppression, freedom from slavery. But this is a thread that is also always pulled, I would say, tight against the compromises of colonial reality. In Edinburgh, Pringle gravitated toward the Whig journalism. For example, Constable Scott's Magazine and the Edinburgh Review. And this explains why, when he was at the Cape, the freedom of the press became a central political battleground for him. He battled against the authoritarian government of Somerset at the time that limited the freedom of speech. He lived in South Africa, as I said, from 1820 to 1826, after his family joined the British government's scheme of assisted emigration that was during the post-Waterloo Depression. So he led there a small Scottish party to a settlement on the eastern frontier, a very conflicted zone that was shaped by the recent conflicts and the dispossession of the natives, the Khoi and Xhosa communities after the frontier war of 1818-1819. Pringle is constantly pulled in different directions. So advocate of liberty, but also settler, a critic of oppression, but also beneficiary of colonial structures. And especially we can see reading his, especially his prose work, that he aligns himself with English colonial authority, especially when he feels under pressure, vulnerable on the frontier, when he felt that he was under attack from the natives, for example. But this instability, these tensions, these contradictions, I think are a cipher, important cipher of his writing. This is an example from his poetry, from The Emigrants, a verse tale, in which he admits that his African experience changed what poetry must do. This reminds me of what Salman Rushdie wrote in Step Across this line, when he says that to cross a frontier is to be transformed. And I think definitely the experience in South Africa transformed Pringle. Not least his idea of what poetry should do, or literature in general should do. Here in this poem, he announces that he will no longer tune the string for Scottish tale, because Africa demands a different kind of song, one that confronts oppression and exposes hidden violence, one that can flash truths full blaze on deeds long hid in night. In South Africa, Pringle first becomes a champion of settler rights and Cape liberalism. As I said, he contrasted Governor Sir Charles Somerset's authoritarian and fierce opposition to the free press. And then eventually actually left South Africa just because he refused to censorship. He could no longer live there in that political situation. So he left the colony in 1826. Apart from being a form of protest, Pringle's writing also works hard, I would say, to translate the African landscape into forms that could be legible within British, especially Scottish, cultural codes. So here we've got something similar that we've seen in Leiden, this sometimes juxtaposition or ways that they find to bridge, the gap, the difference between other and self, between, in this case, the African other and Scottishness. His writing presents multiple, I would say, many examples of what we may define as a transcultural landscape, in which metropolitan conventions interact with colonial realities and conditions. This is an example from the narrative of a residency in South Africa. Here the settler's arrival is framed through biblical language, the biblical language of exile. Again, an ambivalent rhetoric, a rhetoric that domesticates settlement by narrating it as a sort of providential displacement rather than colonial occupation, which was in fact happening. We can feel here reading this nostalgia, because nostalgia is part of what is happening, but at the same nostalgia, about what's left behind. But there is also ideology. I believe here pastoral and biblical rhetoric seems to soften the violence of occupation, to soften the violence of occupation, framing it as sort of moral trial, a moral effort or redemptive endurance. So again, ambivalence. But in Pringle, this transculturation, this transcultural operation is not always connected with domination. Sometimes home and host environments merge into unexpected affinities. And this is one of my favorite examples, of this unexpected or affinities here, even in brambles. The scent of the mimosa trees are compared to the scent of primrose tufts in Scottish dale. Then, in the second column, you can see how this familiar air is broken. It's broken by the negative, sublime of Africa, these prospects of wild, grotesque and strange. In Pringle's work, as I said, there are various contradictions that we can detect that make it rather complex and enticing at the same time. And the frontier pressures that he experienced living there deepen certainly these contradictions. When we read the narrative, sometimes his narrative, we realize how he sympathizes sometimes with native resistance. And it's interesting because it draws analogies between the natives and the Highland clans, the chiefs, the leaders of Highland clans that defended their culture against, an encroaching order. But then he never disputes Britain's presence in South Africa. So when he feels under threat, we can say the humanitarian abolitionist hardens into the defensive farmer or the pragmatic colonist. Okay, so but this instability, I don't know, maybe it's less of a personal failing than the structural dilemma of colonial life. From the mid-1820s, Pringle's abolitionism becomes sharper when he's back in Britain. His protest becomes institutional, turning into collaboration with important abolitionists such as Wilberforce, Baxter, Clarkson, Macaulay. And this protest, I think, is captured powerfully through poems such as this ones. So I'll give you two further examples of this poetry. One is The Slave Dealer and the other one is Slavery. In The Slave Dealer, slavery appears, as you can see, as moral contamination, a sense of guilt which becomes metonymized, I would say, as a blood stain that cannot be washed away. The poem insists on the fact that this is not warrior's blood, but it is the blood of slavery. A violence that is very deep, a violence that is corrupting. And then in slavery is condemned as bitter draught, as you can read, a leprosy that corrupts both slave and master, because it reduces the slave into a beast of burden, but the master into a demon or an oppressor who shares the hell he makes. Okay, so these are strong words afterwards. Yet even at his most passionate, Pringle's framework remains Protestant Christian rather than anti-imperial. He remained convinced that Christianity would bring civilizing benefits to the natives. And this tension appears rather starkly, I would say, here in this passage from the narrative, in which he calls for embracing Africans as men and brothers, but then immediately imagines a new and nobler career of conquest justified by justice, kindness, and Christian truth. So what we read here is, in a sense, the logic that runs through Pringle's entire career and opera omnia. So on the one hand, moral protest, as we said, against the censorship, against oppression, against slavery. On the other hand, an enduring willingness to imagining imperial expansion as a liberal civilizing mission, or at least including also this liberal civilizing mission. So Pringle's works, like Barnard's and Leiden's, do not ever resolve this, the contradictions I've tried to focus on, but certainly they stage them. They stage them. They make us see them. Now, to conclude, what emerges from bringing these three case studies together is not a single position, not a single Scottish, if we want, position on empire, but a set of recurring tensions across genres and sites, tensions that are intellectual, that are moral, also formal, as we've seen, for example, in Barnard. Tensions that, as I said, in Scottish migration literature, migration writing, become, unusually visible and also, I think, interesting if we consider, on the whole, generally the history of Scotland within the British Isles. For Leiden, this tensions, the ambivalence takes the form of knowledge as power. His desire to master languages belongs, as I said, to an Enlightenment confidence in comparison, classification, also improvement, and all this becomes inseparable from the institutions and the offices of governance. And in his work, this ambiguity produces moments, I said, of unease. But at the same time, this unease never becomes a refusal of colonial or imperial structures. Barnard writes from the Cape as a woman, we said, close to colonial power, a writing repeatedly performs disclaimers that allow her to observe colonial life while remaining within propriety for a woman at the time. So a text oscillates between sympathy and self-policing, and they register colonial contradictions through, the strategies that I have briefly, maybe not enough focused on. So it's never direct polemic, but she uses tone, she uses hesitation, at the same time expressing a desire to witness what she sees and also report, because she does report what she saw. Pringle turns poetry and also, as well as his prose, that is always documentary, into instruments of exposure. So in this case, there is exposure. There's not the same the reticence we find in Barnard, because of course there is a gender line that we cannot overlook. So it turns his work into instruments of exposure, but cannot finally or definitely separate moral protest from the settler project. So remains a settler, and he remains someone who believes, as I said, in this civilizing value of conquest. So the point here is that the liberal humanitarian and the imperial agent are inseparable in the case of Pringle. So that's why Calder said, an imperialist, Christian imperialist, humanitarian imperialist. And so that oxymoron, I think, translates very well his predicament. Read together, these three writers show why Scottish literature is such a privileged site for thinking about empires, because, well, Scottishness can appear simultaneously as the other within Britishness, but also an agent of domination elsewhere. And also Enlightenment ideals of sympathy, Scottish Enlightenment ideals of sympathy and progress are at the same time both ethically generative and politically complicit. So I regard these authors as threshold figures, aware of but also incapable of resolving the inconsistencies involved in their colonial condition. As I said, none of their texts offers a stable resolution, but I think it's precisely in this instability between knowledge and power, sympathy and hierarchy, or silence and testimony, that they help us understand why the moral and the political questions raised by Scotland's imperial entanglements continue to resonate strongly even in post-colonial debates today. Okay, so that is my final point, and that also justifies why I've been working for so long on them, and why I think they still do deserve more attention that I've received so far by the critics. Thank you very much for your attention.